The radar screen showed nothing but static where Viper 12 should have been. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, 36 personnel stared at monitors that had gone dark 30 seconds ago. The A-10 Thunderbolt had disappeared over the Hindu Kush Mountains during what should have been a routine close air support mission. Captain Reeves stood frozen at the tactical display, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The last transmission had been clipped, almost casual. Then silence. The kind of silence that made experienced officers reach for phones they didn't want to dial. Major Karina Volkov sat in the briefing room 2 floors above, reviewing gun camera footage from an earlier mission. She'd been pulled from the flight rotation 3 days ago after what the wing commander called an abundance of caution. At 42, she was the oldest combat pilot in the squadron and the only woman flying the Warthog in theater. Her call sign was Ruzelka, given to her 12 years ago by a Russian exchange pilot who'd watched her fly and said she moved through the sky like a water spirit, beautiful and impossible to pin down. The Americans in her first squadron had kept it, though most of them didn't know what it meant. They just knew she could put 30mm rounds through a window at 4,000 feet while pulling 4GS in a turn. The door opened without warning. Colonel Martinez stood in the frame, his face carrying an expression Karina had seen before. It was the look of a man who just lost something valuable and was calculating the cost. She was on her feet before he spoke. He told her about Viper 12. He told her about the missing pilot, about the radio silence, about the last known coordinates in a valley where the Taliban had been moving heavy weapons for 3 weeks. He didn't tell her why he was telling her this, instead of scrambling the alert birds. She asked the question with her eyes. Martinez closed the door behind him. What he said next would become the subject of 3 separate investigations and 1 congressional inquiry, though none of that mattered in the moment. He said Viper 12's pilot was Captain Lauren Meridian, 26 years old, 200 hours in type, flying her first real combat mission. He said the ready aircraft had a hydraulic fault and wouldn't launch for another 40 minutes. He said the window for rescue was closing faster than anyone wanted to admit. Then he said the thing that made Karina's jaw tighten, the thing that explained why she'd been grounded. Command had received intelligence that a surface-to-air missile battery had moved into the sector. Old Soviet equipment, but functional. They'd pulled their most experienced pilot to preserve experience and sent the rookie instead. Karina was already walking toward the door. Martinez didn't stop her, but his voice followed her into the hallway. He reminded her that she was grounded, that launching without authorization would end her career, that the rules existed for reasons written in blood. She stopped with her hand on the stairwell door and looked back at him. Her voice was steady, carrying the accent she'd mostly trained out of her English, but which returned in moments of absolute clarity. She told him that rules were written by people who'd never watched a 26-year-old die, because the experienced pilot was too valuable to risk. She told him to start the paperwork because she was already gone. The flight line was chaos contained by procedure. Maintenance crews swarmed around aircraft in various states of readiness. Karina moved through them like water through stones, her stride purposeful enough that nobody questioned her presence. She found her assigned aircraft, tail number 817, still loaded from the morning's canceled mission. 2,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition in the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles under the wings. 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for self-defense that she'd probably never need. The A-10 wasn't pretty. It looked like something designed by people who'd given up on aesthetics and focused entirely on keeping pilots alive while they killed tanks. Staff Sergeant Chen was doing a final inspection on the port landing gear. He saw her coming and straightened slowly. He'd been her crew chief for 8 months and could read her intentions in the set of her shoulders. He asked if this was official. She told him it wasn't. He asked if she was going anyway. She confirmed it with a nod. He looked at the aircraft, then at her, then at the operations building where colonels made decisions that got people killed. Then he pulled the safety pins from the ordnance, and handed them to her in silent complicity. The pre-flight checks took 4 minutes. Karina's hands moved through the sequence with muscle memory older than most of the pilots in the squadron. Battery on. Hydraulics check. Flight controls free and correct. The A-10's cockpit was tight and utilitarian, designed for function in combat, not comfort in flight. She strapped in with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines spooled up with their distinctive high-pitched whine, the sound that ground troops called the Song of Salvation, and enemy forces heard as an incoming death sentence. Tower called her before she'd finished the engine start sequence. They wanted confirmation of her flight authorization. She gave them her tail number and call sign, then told them she was launching under Emergency Pilot Authority for combat search and rescue. The controller's voice went tight with confusion. He said there was no CSAR mission on the board. She replied that there was now and released the brakes. The A-10 rolled forward with ponderous inevitability. 30,000 pounds of titanium bathtub and ammunition, moving toward a runway that might end her career before she ever left the ground. Martinez's voice came through on the discrete frequency. He told her to abort. She switched frequencies. He followed her to the next channel and the next. Finally, he stopped talking and just kept the channel open, a silent acknowledgement that he couldn't stop her and wouldn't try hard enough to make it official. The A-10 reached the runway threshold. She pushed the throttles forward and felt the engines respond with their characteristic lag, then surge. The aircraft accelerated with none of the graceful speed of a fighter jet, just brutal, determined momentum. The nose wheel lifted at 120 knots. The main gear left the ground at 140. She was airborne and already calculating vectors to the last known position of Viper 12. The Hindu Kush mountains rose ahead like ancient guardians, their peaks hidden in afternoon clouds that promised turbulence and reduced visibility. Perfect conditions for an ambush. Perfect terrain for someone to die alone and unrecorded. Karina leveled off at 12,000 feet and punched the coordinates into her navigation system. The A-10 settled into its cruising speed of 320 knots, slow by modern standards but sufficient for what came next. The radio traffic told its own story. Combat search and rescue assets were spinning up, but the alert helicopter was 45 minutes from launch. Fast movers from the Navy carrier group were being diverted, but they were supersonic jets designed for speed, not the low-altitude grinding work of finding someone in mountain terrain. The Air Force Pave Hawk crews were doing final checks, their professionalism evident in clipped radio calls that couldn't quite hide their urgency. Everyone was moving as fast as possible. Everyone knew it might not be fast enough. Karina switched to guard frequency and transmitted in the clear. She identified herself by call sign and aircraft type. She gave her position and heading. She stated her intention to proceed to the last known coordinates of Viper 12 and conduct visual search and possible combat rescue. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, an eternity in radio time. Then the AWACS controller came back, his voice carefully neutral. He confirmed her position and asked for confirmation of her authorization code. She didn't have one. She told him that directly. Another pause. Then the controller asked if she was aware she was violating about 6 different regulations. She confirmed she was aware. He asked if she intended to continue. She said affirmative. There was a long moment of dead air. Then the AWACS controller's voice came back, slightly warmer. He said he was updating her tactical feed with real-time intelligence on enemy positions in the sector. He said to stay safe and bring both pilots home. He didn't say he was risking his own career by providing support to an unauthorized mission. He didn't have to. The mountains grew larger in her canopy. Karina descended to 8,000 feet, trading altitude for better visibility under the cloud deck. The terrain below was browns and grays, ancient stone carved by water and wind into ridges that could hide entire armies. The Taliban knew these mountains like the Americans knew their hometown streets. They used the terrain with practiced efficiency, appearing and disappearing like smoke. Finding one down pilot in this landscape would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach, except the sand was shooting at you. Viper 12's last known coordinates placed her 15 nautical miles ahead. Karina armed up her systems and began a tactical descent. The A-10 dropped toward the valley floor with controlled aggression, its nose pointed at terrain that rushed up with startling speed. At 2,000 feet above ground level, she pulled back and leveled off, her eyes scanning the landscape with practiced intensity. Rock formations cast long shadows in the afternoon sun. Small villages clung to hillsides, their mud brick buildings indistinguishable from the earth itself. Somewhere down there was a pilot who'd probably never expected to use her survival training for real. The tactical display showed enemy activity concentrated in the northern part of the valley. Intelligence estimated 40 to 60 fighters with small arms and machine guns. The SA-7 missile battery that had been reported remained unconfirmed, a phantom threat that might or might not exist. Karina kept her altitude low and her speed up, making herself a harder target. The A-10 wasn't agile, but it was tough. The titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit could take hits from 23mm cannon fire and keep flying. She'd once landed an A-10 with 3 feet of wing missing and 1 engine dead. The aircraft had a reputation for bringing pilots home. She switched to survival radio frequency and began transmitting. Call sign Viper 12. This is Ruzelka on SAR Freak. Authenticate. Nothing came back. She repeated the call every 30 seconds while her eyes never stopped moving across the terrain below. The valley narrowed ahead, channeling her flight path into a funnel that tactical doctrine said to avoid. She flew into it anyway because the coordinates were deeper in and someone had to go first. Then her radio crackled. The voice was female, young, and trying hard to sound calm. Ruzelka Viper 12 Authenticate Delta November 77. The authentication code matched. Karina felt something tight in her chest release slightly. She acknowledged and asked for status. The response came back halting. Viper 12 reported she'd taken ground fire during her attack run. Hydraulics had failed. She'd ejected at 4,000 feet after the aircraft became uncontrollable. She'd landed hard in the valley and was currently concealed in a rock formation approximately 200 meters from a small village. She could hear voices. She thought they were searching for her. Karina asked if she was injured. Viper 12 said possible concussion and definitely a sprained ankle. She could move but not fast. Karina checked her fuel state and calculated how long she could remain on station. 20 minutes of combat time before she'd need to climb out for a tanker rendezvous. 20 minutes to find a pilot in hostile territory and either extract her or hold the enemy back until proper rescue assets arrived. She asked Viper 12 if she had her survival radio beacon. Affirmative. She told her to activate it for 5 seconds only, then shut it down. Too long and enemy forces with direction-finding equipment could locate her. Too short and Karina might miss it. The beacon signal showed up on her display as a tiny blip, there and gone. Karina marked the position and began her approach. The village sat in a shallow bowl of land surrounded by ridges. Bad terrain for the helicopter that would eventually need to make the pickup. Good terrain for defenders who knew how to use elevation. She could see figures moving in the village now, small dark shapes that might be civilians or might be fighters. In this valley, the distinction was often fluid. Her targeting pod showed more detail. Men with rifles moving in an organized search pattern. They were working outward from the center of the village in widening circles. Professional movement, not panicked. These weren't farmers with old hunting rifles. These were trained fighters who knew a downed pilot represented either a valuable hostage or a propaganda victory if her body was recovered. They were perhaps 10 minutes from Viper 12's position, maybe less. Karina armed a Maverick missile and designated the largest building in the village. The weapon system chirped its lock tone. She held position for 3 seconds, then released the weapon and broke hard left. The missile came off the rail with a solid thump, its rocket motor igniting as it tracked toward the target. She didn't watch the impact. She was already rolling back to identify her next target. The explosion echoed through the valley, a rolling boom that would make the searchers think twice about continuing their advance. The effect was immediate. The figures in the village scattered, seeking cover. Some ran into buildings, others flattened against walls. The organized search pattern dissolved into individual survival instinct. Karina used the chaos to make another pass, this time firing a burst from her GAU-8 cannon into the hillside above the village. The 30-millimeter rounds tore into the rock with distinctive thunder that announced exactly what kind of aircraft was overhead. 200 rounds in 3 seconds, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to shred an engine block. The message was clear: keep searching and die. She climbed back to 3,000 feet and circled the area. Below, Viper 12 was transmitting again. She'd heard the explosion and the gun run. She asked if that was Ruzelka providing the fireworks. Karina confirmed and told her to stay put and stay hidden. Help was coming, but it would take time. Viper 12 acknowledged with a voice that sounded steadier now that she knew she wasn't alone. Karina checked her fuel again. 15 minutes left on station. The math was getting tight. The AWACS controller came back on frequency. He reported that CSAR assets were airborne and inbound, estimated arrival in 25 minutes. Fast movers from the carrier were being held in reserve in case heavy fire support was needed. The Pave Hawk helicopter crew was requesting tactical updates on enemy positions and known threats. Karina provided what she knew, her voice clinical and precise. 40 to 60 dismounts with small arms observed. No heavy weapons identified. Possible SA-7 in the area, but unconfirmed. Enemies scattered after initial engagement, but likely to reorganize. The controller thanked her and asked a question he probably wasn't supposed to ask. He wanted to know why she'd launched unauthorized. Karina considered her answer for a moment. She could have said something about duty or honor. She could have quoted regulations about pilot responsibility for other pilots. Instead, she told him the truth. She said she'd been the new pilot once, flying alone in hostile territory, and she remembered what it felt like to think nobody was coming. She said no pilot should die thinking that. The controller was quiet for a moment. Then he said copy all and advised her that the wing commander was requesting her immediate return to base. She acknowledged the message and stayed on station. The enemy was regrouping. She could see it in the movement patterns below. Small groups emerging from cover, linking up, organizing. They knew a helicopter would be coming. They were preparing an ambush. Standard tactics for this kind of situation. Let the first aircraft expend its ammunition, then hit the rescue bird when it was vulnerable in the pickup. Karina had seen it before. She began planning her next engagement, calculating angles and distances, deciding which targets would disrupt their organization most effectively. Movement caught her eye on the eastern ridge. Technical vehicles, 2 of them, moving fast along a dirt trail. Toyotas with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds, the preferred transportation of fighters throughout the region. They were heading toward the valley floor, probably responding to the engagement. She designated the lead vehicle and fired another Maverick. The missile tracked true, and the technical disappeared in a flash of fire and smoke. The second vehicle stopped, then reversed course, its driver smart enough to realize staying in the open was suicide. Viper 12 came back on the radio. Her voice had changed, tighter with stress. She reported hearing engines, multiple vehicles, getting closer to her position. Karina told her to stay calm and stay hidden. She was running the numbers in her head. 5 minutes of fuel left before she'd have to climb out. The CSAR bird was still 20 minutes away. The gap was widening instead of closing. She made a decision that would later be cited in both her commendation and her reprimand. She called the tanker and told them she needed an emergency refuel at low altitude in the combat area. The tanker crew responded with professional alarm. They'd have to descend into potential threat range. They could be shot down. She acknowledged that and said do it anyway. The KC-135 tanker began its descent from safe altitude, while Karina made another gun run on enemy positions. The 30mm cannon sang its 2-second song and fighters scattered like leaves in wind. She pulled off target and climbed, scanning for the tanker. It appeared on her tactical display, descending through 12,000 feet, coming into the valley like a flying gas station with no armor and no weapons. The aircraft commander was either very brave or very crazy. Probably both. The refueling join-up happened at 8,000 feet with mountains on 3 sides and enemies below. Karina slid into position behind the tanker with the precision of a surgeon. The boom operator extended the refueling probe, and she made contact on the first attempt. Fuel flowed into her tanks while she maintained formation, her eyes splitting attention between the tanker and the ground. Every second in the basket was a second she couldn't maneuver. Every second was a second enemy forces could set up for a shot. The boom operator was professional and fast. He pushed fuel at maximum rate. 2,000 pounds transferred in 90 seconds. She disconnected and broke away, calling thanks to the tanker crew who just risked their lives for a pilot they'd never met. Now she had time. Another 30 minutes on station with enough fuel to make a difference. She resumed her orbit over Viper 12's position and continued her tactical assessment. The enemy had pulled back slightly, respecting the A-10's presence but not abandoning their search. They were waiting for her to leave or run out of ammunition. Patient and professional. She'd have to show them that patience worked both ways. The AWACS controller updated her on CSAR progress. The Pave Hawk was 15 minutes out. Fast movers were on station overhead at high altitude, available for tasking if needed. A second A-10 had launched from Bagram and was inbound to relieve her. The wing commander had apparently given up on ordering her back and decided to send reinforcement instead. She wondered if that meant her career was salvageable or if Martinez had simply decided to double down on the court-martial. She decided it didn't matter. What mattered was the young pilot hiding in the rocks below. Viper 12 came back on frequency. Her voice was quieter now, almost whispering. She reported seeing fighters approximately 50 meters from her position. They were searching methodically, checking every hiding place. She didn't think they'd seen her yet, but it was only a matter of time. Karina acknowledged and made another low pass, firing her cannon into the hillside in a deliberate pattern that walked rounds closer to the search party without actually hitting them. The message was clear. She knew where they were. Get closer to the pilot and die. The fighters withdrew again, but Karina could see their frustration in their movement. They knew she couldn't stay forever. They knew the pilot was close. They were calculating the same math she was, trying to determine if they could wait her out. She decided to change their calculation. She armed her last 2 Mavericks and began identifying high-value targets in the area, command and control positions, rally points, anything that looked like organization. She fired both missiles in rapid sequence, targeting buildings on opposite sides of the village. Both hits were solid. The explosions sent the message she intended. This wasn't harassment fire. This was systematic destruction of their infrastructure. Stay in this valley and lose everything. The second A-10 checked in on frequency. Call sign Hammer 21, another veteran pilot named Captain Marcus Webb, asking for tactical situation update. Karina briefed him in 30 seconds. Enemy disposition, friendly position, ammunition expenditure. Webb acknowledged and began his own tactical approach. Now there were 2 warthogs in the valley. The enemy's math had just gotten much worse. Webb made a gun run on the eastern ridge while Karina covered the western approach. They worked together with minimal communication, the kind of coordination that came from training and trust. The valley filled with the sound of GAU-8 cannons, and enemy fighters stopped advancing entirely. The Pave Hawk called inbound at 5 minutes. The helicopter crew asked for weather, enemy positions, and recommended approach vector. Karina provided all 3, her voice calm and professional. She suggested a fast approach from the south, using terrain masking until the last possible moment. The helicopter crew acknowledged. They'd done this before. They knew the drill. They also knew that the next 5 minutes would determine whether everyone went home or whether more names got added to memorial walls. Karina descended to 1,000 feet and positioned herself between the helicopter's approach path and the known enemy positions. Webb took high cover. They were setting up a defensive box, standard doctrine for CSAR, making the helicopter the most protected thing in the valley. Karina could see the Pave Hawk now, flying fast and low, its pilots threading between ridges with practiced skill. The aircraft looked impossibly vulnerable, a large, slow target filled with fuel and people. Enemy fighters saw it too. They opened fire with small arms. Tracers reached up toward the helicopter like angry fireflies. Karina rolled in on the source of fire and unleashed everything she had left in the cannon. 500 rounds in a single sustained burst that tore the hillside apart and silenced the guns. Webb hit another position on the opposite ridge. The helicopter kept coming, its pilots committed to the approach, knowing that turning away now would mean doing this all over again. The Pave Hawk flared into a hover over Viper 12's position. The door gunners opened fire on anything that moved. The pararescue jumper went down the hoist like a spider on silk. Karina orbited tight, her eyes never resting, looking for the next threat. She saw movement on the eastern ridge and called it out. Webb engaged with his remaining ordnance. The rescue unfolded with brutal efficiency. The PJ reached Viper 12. She was clipped into the hoist. They were coming up. Then someone on the ground got lucky or skilled. An RPG round arced up from concealment and passed within meters of the helicopter. The pilot reacted instinctively, breaking the hover and sliding sideways. Viper 12 was still on the hoist, dangling in space. The PJ held her with one arm while his other hand maintained grip on the cable. Karina's heart stopped for the second it took the pilot to stabilize. Then they were climbing again. Viper 12 and the PJ reached the helicopter door. Hands pulled them inside. The hoist retracted. The Pave Hawk nosed over and accelerated away from the valley floor. Karina and Webb provided cover until the helicopter was clear of the valley and climbing toward safe altitude. Only then did Karina check her fuel state and realize she'd been running on fumes and will for the last few minutes. She called Webb and told him she was climbing out for the tanker. He acknowledged and said he'd maintain coverage until CSAR was completely clear. His voice carried something like respect, maybe even admiration. She didn't respond beyond a standard acknowledgement. There would be time for conversation later. The tanker rendezvous was routine, almost boring after the intensity of the rescue. Fuel transferred. Systems normal. She disconnected and began the flight back to Bagram. The adrenaline was starting to wear off now, replaced by the familiar exhaustion that came after combat. Her hands were steady on the controls, but she could feel the tremor waiting beneath the surface. She'd been flying for 90 minutes that felt like 90 days. The AWACS controller came back on frequency. He said the wing commander wanted a direct call when she was back in controlled airspace. She acknowledged with a voice that suggested she knew what was coming. Courts-martial didn't happen instantly, but they were inevitable. She'd violated direct orders. She'd launched an unauthorized mission. She'd endangered a tanker crew. The fact that everything had worked out didn't change the fact that she'd broken rules that existed for legitimate reasons. She understood the consequences and accepted them. Some things were worth the price. But then the controller said something unexpected. He said CSAR had reached safe altitude and Viper 12 was confirmed stable. Possible concussion, sprained ankle, some bruising. She'd be fine. Then he said something else. He said Viper 12 had asked the rescue crew to pass a message. She wanted Ruzelka to know that she was sorry for the trouble and thankful to be alive. The controller paused, then added his own postscript. He said what Karina had done was either the bravest thing he'd seen or the stupidest, and he was still deciding which. He said to stay safe on the flight home. Karina didn't trust herself to respond. She clicked the transmit button twice in acknowledgement and continued flying. The mountains passed beneath her, ancient and uncaring. She'd been flying over them for 8 months, dropping ordnance on enemy positions, supporting ground troops in firefights, going home to write reports that nobody would remember in 10 years. Today would be different. Today would follow her for the rest of her career, for better or worse. She found she didn't care much either way. Bagram appeared on the horizon. The tower cleared her for straightened approach. She flew the pattern by memory, gear down, flaps set, speed controlled. The runway rose to meet her, and the A-10's main gear touched with familiar firmness. She taxied clear and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was profound. Staff Sergeant Chen was waiting on the flight line with a crew of maintainers. He'd probably expected to be court-martialed alongside her. Instead, he gave her a thumbs up as she climbed down from the cockpit. Colonel Martinez was waiting in the operations building. His face was unreadable. He told her to come with him. They walked in silence through corridors filled with personnel who watched with poorly concealed interest. Everyone had heard by now: unauthorized launch, combat rescue, direct violation of orders. The story was probably growing with each retelling. She wondered how much was true and how much was already legend. Martinez led her to a conference room and closed the door. Inside, the wing commander waited with two other officers she didn't recognize. They wore the uniforms and insignia of investigators, people whose job was to determine if rules had been broken and by how much. Martinez told her to sit. She remained standing. Old habit from her years in the Russian Air Force, where defiance had to be subtle but present. The wing commander stared at her for a long moment. Then he dismissed everyone else from the room. When the door closed, he spoke. He told her she was grounded pending investigation, that her actions constituted multiple violations of military regulations, that she'd endangered personnel and aircraft, that commanding officers couldn't allow subordinates to simply decide which orders to follow. She listened without expression. Everything he said was true. When he finished, she asked if Viper 12 was really okay. He confirmed she was. Karina nodded. She said then it was worth it. The wing commander's expression shifted slightly. He asked if she understood she'd just ended her career. She told him she understood. He asked if she'd do it again. She said yes without hesitation. He was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he'd been a young pilot once, flying missions where he was in over his head, and he remembered what it felt like when more experienced pilots hung him out to dry in the name of risk management. He said he'd promised himself that if he ever had the authority, he'd build a different culture. Then he said the investigation would continue and she should expect formal proceedings. But his voice had softened slightly. They let her go with instructions to remain on base and available for questioning. She walked back to her quarters through a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Some looked at her like she was crazy. Others looked at her like she'd done something they wished they had the courage to do. She avoided eye contact with everyone and went to her room. Inside, she sat on her bunk and let the exhaustion finally settle in. Her hands were shaking now, the delayed reaction her body had been holding back during the mission. Someone knocked on her door an hour later. She answered to find Viper 12 standing there in medical scrubs, one foot in a walking boot. The young pilot looked exhausted and smaller than she'd seemed in her personnel file photo. Her name was Captain Lauren Meridian. She'd graduated from the Air Force Academy 3 years ago. She'd wanted to fly A-10's since she was 12 and saw one at an air show. This had been her first real combat mission, and it had nearly been her last. She asked if she could come in. Karina stepped aside. Meridian entered and stood awkwardly, clearly unsure how to begin. Finally, she said, "Thank you, just that, thank you." Karina told her it wasn't necessary. Meridian shook her head. She said it was absolutely necessary. She said she'd heard the radio traffic. She knew Karina had launched unauthorized. She knew what that would cost. She said nobody should sacrifice their career for someone they'd never met. Karina looked at her for a long moment. Then she told her a story she'd never told anyone in the American military. She talked about being a young pilot in the Russian Air Force, flying ground attack missions in Chechnya 20 years ago. She talked about a mission that went wrong, about ejecting in hostile territory, about hiding in rubble and hearing fighters searching for her. She talked about an older pilot who'd disobeyed orders to come back for her, who'd held enemy forces at bay until rescue arrived. She never learned his name. He'd been killed in a training accident 6 months later, but she'd promised herself that if she ever had the chance, she'd be that pilot for someone else. Meridian listened with tears running silently down her face. When Karina finished, the young pilot asked if she could do anything to help with the investigation. Karina told her to focus on recovery and learning from the experience. She said the investigation would proceed according to regulations, and there was nothing to be done about it. Meridian looked like she wanted to argue but recognized the futility. She thanked Karina again and left. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. Karina gave testimony 5 times. She answered questions about her decision-making process, her assessment of risk, her understanding of regulations. She was honest about everything. Yes, she knew launching was unauthorized. Yes, she understood the potential consequences. Yes, she'd do it again under the same circumstances. The investigators wrote everything down with expressions that gave away nothing. Other people gave testimony too. Martinez explained why he'd informed Karina about the situation. The tanker crew defended their decision to support an unauthorized mission. Staff Sergeant Chen admitted to removing safety pins without proper authorization. The AWACS controller who'd provided tactical support was questioned about his judgment. Everyone involved was potentially facing career-ending consequences for doing what they thought was right. Then something unexpected happened. The story got out, not through official channels but through the invisible network of deployed personnel who communicated via social media and personal messages. Someone who'd heard the radio traffic wrote about it online. Someone else shared it. Within days, the rescue had become a story that thousands of people were following. Military forums debated the ethics of Karina's decision. Some called her a hero, others called her reckless. Everyone had an opinion. The attention made things complicated. The Air Force didn't want to look like it was punishing someone for saving a life, but it also couldn't appear to endorse flagrant violation of orders. The Public Relations Office was reportedly working overtime to figure out the right messaging. Karina ignored all of it. She'd done what she did. The consequences would be what they would be. She spent her days working out, reading, and avoiding the flood of interview requests that came through official channels. Webb came to see her during the second week of investigation. He brought coffee and sat across from her in the dining facility. He asked how she was holding up. She said she was fine. He said she was lying, but he understood. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then he told her something interesting. The squadron had taken a vote, completely unofficial and unauthorized. They decided that if Karina was court-martialed, they would collectively request to testify on her behalf. All of them. Every pilot in the squadron. Karina was surprised and tried not to show it. She asked why they'd do that. Webb looked at her like she'd asked why water was wet. He said because she'd proven what kind of pilot she was. Because she'd shown that experience and courage weren't about age or gender or what language you spoke first. Because she'd done what every pilot hoped they'd have the courage to do if the moment came. Because she was Ruzelka, and legends didn't apologize for being legendary. The investigation concluded with recommendations that were forwarded up the chain of command. Karina wasn't told what they contained. She waited with the patience of someone who'd survived worse uncertainties. Then, on a Tuesday morning 4 weeks after the rescue, she was summoned to the wing commander's office. Martinez was there. So were the investigators. She stood at attention and waited for the verdict. The wing commander spoke without preamble. The investigation had found that she'd violated multiple regulations, that her actions constituted insubordination and reckless endangerment, that proper protocols existed for combat search and rescue, and she'd ignored them. All of this would go in her permanent record. She accepted it with a slight nod. Then the wing commander said something that made her look up sharply. He said that the investigation had also found her actions prevented the probable death or capture of a friendly pilot, that her tactical judgment during the rescue was sound, that her performance under pressure was exceptional. Therefore, he was issuing a letter of reprimand for the violations, which would remain in her file and effectively end any chance of promotion beyond her current rank. and he was also recommending her for the Distinguished Flying Cross for valor in combat. The two actions would coexist in her record, a permanent reminder that the world was complicated and right actions sometimes came with wrong methods. She was reinstated to flight status effective immediately. The investigation was closed. Karina processed this for a moment. She asked if she could speak freely. The wing commander granted permission. She asked if he was serious about the medal. He said he was. She asked if he understood that she'd do the exact same thing again if the situation arose. He said he was counting on it, but next time maybe she could file the paperwork first. The corner of his mouth might have twitched slightly. It was hard to tell. She returned to flight status the next day. The squadron treated her exactly the same as before, which meant occasional mockery, professional respect, and the kind of camaraderie that came from shared experience. Meridian was cleared to fly 2 weeks later. She requested Karina as her instructor for her requalification flights. The request was approved. They flew together 4 times, working through tactical scenarios and emergency procedures. Meridian was a good pilot with sound instincts. She just needed experience, and Karina had plenty of that to share. The last flight was a free-play exercise against Air Force F-16s playing adversary roles. Karina and Meridian flew as a two-ship, working together to survive against faster, more maneuverable opponents. They used terrain and mutual support, the classic warthog tactics that turned the A-10's apparent disadvantages into survivability. The F-16s were aggressive and skilled, but the A-10 pilots were patient and cunning. By the end of the exercise, both warthogs had survived and scored simulated kills. The F-16 pilots bought drinks that evening with good-natured grumbling about unfair tactics. 6 months later, Karina was sitting in the same briefing room where Martinez had told her about Viper 12, but this time she was giving the briefing. The topic was combat search and rescue from the perspective of the on-scene commander. She talked about decision-making under pressure, about balancing risk and reward, about the responsibility experienced pilots had to those with less experience. She didn't talk about her own unauthorized mission. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew the story. It had become part of squadron lore, the kind of tale that got told to new pilots with embellishments and arguments about details. Meridian was in the audience, now flying regular combat missions with growing confidence. Webb was there, preparing for his own upgrade to flight lead. The new pilots who'd arrived in the months since the rescue listened with expressions of intense focus, trying to absorb lessons that couldn't really be taught, only experienced. Karina finished her briefing with a simple statement. She said that regulations existed for good reasons and should be followed. But that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same thing, and that when that moment came, each pilot would have to make their own decision and live with the consequences. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony happened during a change of command event 3 months later. Karina stood in formation while a general she'd never met read the citation. It talked about her actions with formal language that made the rescue sound clean and planned. It didn't mention the investigation or the letter of reprimand. It didn't mention the tanker crew who'd risked everything or the AWACS controller who'd provided support against regulations. It was a nice story that was mostly true but incomplete, like all official histories. Meridian was there in the audience, along with the rest of the squadron. Martinez stood at attention nearby, his face showing nothing but professional bearing. When the general pinned the medal on Karina's uniform, she thought about the Russian pilot who'd saved her 20 years ago. She wondered if he'd faced similar consequences. She wondered if he'd thought it was worth it. She decided he probably had and probably did. The reception afterward was loud and crowded. People congratulated her with genuine warmth. Some of them had thought she was crazy 6 months ago. Now they treated the rescue like it had been inevitable. That was how legends worked. They became smoother with retelling, the rough edges polished away until only the heroic core remained. Karina accepted the congratulations with grace and modest deflection. She was good at that. 42 years of life had taught her how to handle attention without encouraging it. Webb found her near the end of the reception. He had a drink in his hand and a thoughtful expression on his face. He said he'd been thinking about call signs, about how Rusalka meant water spirit, something beautiful and untouchable. He said it was a good call sign but maybe not complete. She asked what he meant. He said that water spirits in the old stories weren't just beautiful. They were also fierce protectors of their territory. They were dangerous to those who threatened what they guarded. She acknowledged this was true. He said the call sign fit her better than the Russian exchange pilot had probably realized. Later, alone in her quarters, Karina looked at the medal. It was a piece of metal shaped like a cross, suspended from a ribbon. It represented valor, courage, and exceptional action in combat. It would go in a box with her other decorations from 2 air forces and 3 wars. She'd earned each one at some cost. This one had cost her promotion potential and added stress to everyone who'd helped. But it had bought Lauren Meridian another chance at life and another chance to become the pilot she could be. That math worked out in Karina's favor. She put the medal away and pulled out her flight gear for the next day's mission. There was always another mission, always another valley where ground troops needed close air support, always another chance to put 30mm rounds where they needed to go. The war continued with grinding inevitability. She would continue flying until they told her to stop or until something stopped her permanently. That was the deal she'd made with herself a long time ago. Meridian stopped by that evening. She'd brought coffee and seemed less awkward than previous visits. They sat in Karina's small room and talked about flying, about the feel of the A-10 at high angles of attack, about the sound the gun made when firing, about the satisfaction of watching enemy forces scatter when you made your attack run. They talked about the parts of the job that regulations manuals didn't cover, the fear that came before missions, the exhaustion after. The way combat flying changed how you saw the world. Eventually, the conversation came around to the rescue. Meridian asked what it had been like making the decision to launch unauthorized. Karina thought about the question carefully. She said it hadn't felt like a decision at all. It had felt like the only possible action given the circumstances. She said that probably sounded crazy to people who'd never been in that position. Meridian said it didn't sound crazy to her. It sounded like exactly what a pilot should do. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Then Meridian said something that stayed with Karina. She said she hoped that if she ever faced a similar situation, she'd have the courage to make the same choice. Karina told her she hoped Meridian never faced that situation, but if she did, Karina had no doubt she'd do the right thing. Meridian asked how she could be so sure. Karina said because she'd seen how Meridian had kept calm while hiding from enemy fighters. She'd heard her voice on the radio, scared but functional. That kind of composure under pressure didn't come from nowhere. It came from character, and character didn't change just because the circumstances did. The deployment ended 2 months later. Karina rotated back to the United States with the rest of the squadron. There was paperwork to file, equipment to turn in, debriefings to give. The transition from combat to garrison felt jarring, like stepping from one world into another. She spent 3 weeks processing through various administrative requirements before finally being released on leave. She went to the mountains in Colorado and spent a week hiking alone, processing what the last 8 months had meant. She thought about Meridian now continuing the deployment with a new rotation of pilots. She thought about Webb and Martinez and Staff Sergeant Chen. She thought about all the people who'd risked something to help with the rescue. She thought about the letter of reprimand in her file and the medal in her desk drawer. 2 sides of the same story. Both true, both important. When she returned from leave, there was a message waiting. The Air Force wanted to know if she'd be interested in an instructor position at the weapons school, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots, passing on everything she'd learned in 20 years of flying attack aircraft for 2 different countries. It was essentially a desk job with occasional flying. It was the kind of position they offered to pilots whose operational careers were effectively over due to things like letters of reprimand. She accepted the position, Not because her career was over, but because teaching seemed like the next right thing to do. She'd been the young pilot who needed saving. She'd been the experienced pilot who did the saving. Maybe now she could be the instructor who taught others how to make those decisions when the moment came. That seemed like a fitting next chapter. The weapons school was different from operational squadrons. The students were already experienced pilots sent to learn advanced tactics. They were smart, motivated, and sometimes cocky. Karina's reputation had preceded her. They knew about the rescue. They knew about the investigation. Some of them looked at her like she was a legend. Others looked at her like she was a cautionary tale. She treated both groups exactly the same, with high expectations and no tolerance for shortcuts. She taught them about close air support and combat search and rescue, about terrain masking and threat avoidance, about the technical capabilities of the A-10 and its limitations. She taught them to love the aircraft not because it was beautiful or fast, but because it was honest. It did exactly what it was designed to do, nothing more or less. It brought pilots home when they made mistakes. It gave ground troops hope when nothing else could. It was an ugly, slow, outdated aircraft that somehow kept being relevant, because the mission it did couldn't be done by anything else. And between lessons about weapons employment and tactical formation, she taught them something else. She taught them about judgment, about the difference between courage and stupidity, about when to follow rules and when to question them. She never explicitly talked about her own unauthorized launch, but her students understood the lessons she was teaching. They could read between the lines of tactics manuals and official procedures to find the deeper truth. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting consequences. Sometimes it was worth it anyway. Meridian visited during one of Karina's early classes. She'd finished her deployment and was now stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, flying with an operational squadron. She looked different, older somehow, with the kind of weathered confidence that came from surviving combat. She sat in on one of Karina's lectures about threat reactions. Afterward, they had dinner at a restaurant off base where pilots congregated to tell stories and complain about leadership. Meridian talked about her recent missions, about flying close air support for troops in contact, about the satisfaction of seeing enemy positions destroyed and hearing the thanks from ground forces, about the fear that still came before each flight and the relief after. She talked about being mentored by other pilots in her new squadron, about learning new tactics and refining old ones. She talked about wanting to be good enough to save someone else someday. Karina listened and recognized herself 20 years ago, full of determination and slowly growing wisdom. She told Meridian about the weapons school, about teaching pilots who thought they knew everything until they realized how much they didn't know, about the satisfaction of watching students grasp complex concepts, about the hope that somewhere in the classes she taught were future pilots who'd make hard decisions and live with them honorably. It was different from combat flying, but no less important. 3 years passed. Karina taught hundreds of students. Some of them were excellent and went on to become flight leads and instructors themselves. Some were adequate and had solid careers. A few washed out, unable to meet the demanding standards. She remembered all of them but tried not to have favorites. Webb came through the school during his upgrade to instructor pilot. He was as good as she'd expected. Professional, skilled, and humble enough to keep learning. He asked her advice on teaching methods. She told him the same thing she told everyone. Teach them to think, not just to follow procedures. The procedures would change. The thinking wouldn't. Martinez retired with full honors and a ceremony that drew former squadron members from across the Air Force. Karina attended and stood in the audience while speakers praised his leadership. He'd navigated the political complexity of her unauthorized rescue mission. He'd supported his pilots while maintaining standards. He'd built a culture where people felt empowered to make hard decisions. After the ceremony, he found her in the crowd. He said he was proud of how she'd handled the aftermath. She thanked him for his support. He said he'd just done what any good commander should do, which was protect his people even when they made his life complicated. Meridian got married to another pilot she'd met during her deployment. Karina received an invitation to the wedding. She attended with genuine happiness for the younger pilot who'd become something like a protege. The ceremony was simple and military, full of people in uniforms and traditions about crossed swords. During the reception, Meridian introduced Karina to her new husband, a helicopter pilot who'd flown Pave Hawks. He recognized her name and call sign. He'd been part of the crew that had pulled Meridian out of the valley that day. He'd been the pararescue jumper on the hoist. They talked about the rescue from their different perspectives. He remembered the ride down the cable, the urgency of getting Meridian clipped in, the RPG round that had passed too close. He said Karina's cover fire had probably saved the helicopter. She said his speed getting Meridian attached had probably saved them all. They agreed it had been a team effort, which was the truth. Successful rescues were always team efforts. Individual heroics made good stories, but team coordination saved lives. The years accumulated. Karina turned 45, then 46. Her hair showed more gray. Her flight suits felt looser as metabolism slowed. But her hands remained steady on the controls and her tactical judgment remained sound. She flew less frequently now, mostly demonstration flights for students or proficiency missions to maintain her qualifications. But each flight reminded her why she'd chosen this career path decades ago. There was freedom in flight, even in a slow attack aircraft. There was purpose in the mission. There was meaning in protecting people who needed protecting. She got a letter from Meridian one autumn afternoon. The younger pilot had been selected for weapons school as a student. She'd be arriving in 6 months to begin the intensive course. She wanted Karina to know and said she hoped they could work together again. Karina felt something warm in her chest reading the letter. The circle was completing itself. The pilot she'd saved was now accomplished enough to attend the most prestigious training program. The lessons were passing to another generation. When Meridian arrived at the school, she'd accumulated 3 years of operational experience and 200 more combat hours. She was confident but not arrogant, skilled but still hungry to learn. Karina watched her in class and saw the transformation that came from surviving and growing. Meridian asked hard questions. She challenged assumptions. She thought critically about tactics and doctrine. She was becoming the kind of pilot who'd make hard decisions when necessary and live with them afterward. Exactly what the Air Force needed. One evening, after a particularly difficult tactical problem, Meridian stayed late to discuss alternative solutions with Karina. They went through different approaches, gaming out scenarios and consequences. Eventually, the conversation drifted to broader topics. Meridian asked how Karina had known she'd make it as a pilot. Karina said she hadn't known. She just refused to consider alternatives. Meridian asked if she ever regretted the choices that had limited her career advancement. Karina thought about it honestly. She said no. She'd flown remarkable aircraft in combat. She'd saved lives. She'd taught others to do the same. That seemed like enough for any career. Meridian graduated from the weapons school with honors. She returned to her operational squadron as an instructor pilot with additional qualifications. She wrote occasionally, usually brief messages about missions or questions about tactics. Karina responded when she could, offering advice that became increasingly brief as Meridian needed less guidance. The student was becoming the master of her own expertise. That was exactly how it should work. Karina received her retirement orders on a Tuesday morning in spring. 25 years of service between 2 countries, 20 years in the A-10, thousands of flight hours, dozens of combat missions, hundreds of students taught, one unauthorized rescue that had defined her American military career. The numbers were impressive but incomplete. They didn't capture what it felt like to fly at dusk with mountains turning purple below. They didn't measure the satisfaction of supporting ground troops in desperate situations. They couldn't quantify the meaning found in teaching someone to be better than they thought they could be. Her retirement ceremony was small, as she requested, just her squadron and some former students. Martinez came, now fully gray and wearing civilian clothes. Webb was there, now an instructor at the school himself. Meridian attended in dress uniform with the rank insignia of a captain, but the bearing of someone heading toward major. The wing commander gave a speech about Karina's service and contributions. He mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross but not the letter of reprimand. He talked about her teaching legacy and the pilots she'd trained. He said the Air Force was better for her service. Then it was Karina's turn. She stood at the podium and looked at the assembled crowd. She talked briefly about her career, about flying for 2 countries and learning that service meant the same thing regardless of flag. She talked about the A-10 and why it mattered, this ugly aircraft that nobody wanted to retire because it did its job too well. She talked about the students she'd taught and the satisfaction of watching them succeed. She didn't talk about the rescue that everyone knew about. She'd said everything necessary about that years ago. But she ended with this. She said that military service was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, that regulations and procedures existed to help accomplish that mission, not to become the mission itself. That judgment mattered more than any checklist. That courage was making hard decisions and accepting consequences. That integrity was doing the right thing even when the cost was high. She said if she taught her students any of those lessons, then her career had been worthwhile. Then she saluted the assembled crowd and walked off the podium. The reception afterward felt like a memorial and a celebration combined. People shared stories about flying with her, learning from her, being saved by her. Some of the stories were true. Others had acquired embellishments over time. She corrected the worst exaggerations but let the smaller ones stand. Legends needed some mythology to survive. And maybe there was value in young pilots hearing stories that inspired them to be better than they thought they could be. Meridian found her near the end of the reception. The younger pilot had tears in her eyes that she was trying to hide. She said she owed Karina her life and her career. Karina shook her head. She said Meridian owed her nothing, that she'd just done what needed doing, that Meridian had earned everything else through her own skill and dedication. Meridian insisted it was more than that. She said Karina had shown her what kind of pilot she wanted to be, what kind of person she wanted to be. Someone who protected others regardless of cost. Karina looked at her former student, now a skilled combat pilot in her own right. She told her something she'd been thinking about for months. She said that the unauthorized rescue had defined her American career, but it wasn't what she was most proud of. What she was proud of was watching Meridian grow from a scared pilot hiding in rocks into a confident instructor who'd someday teach her own students. That transformation was worth more than any medal or investigation. That was the real legacy of that day in the valley. They hugged briefly, the kind of embrace between warriors who'd shared something profound. Then Meridian stepped back and saluted with perfect crispness. Karina returned it with the same precision. No words were necessary. Understanding passed between them in silence. The circle was complete. The student had become the teacher. The protected had become the protector. The story would continue through new generations with new names but the same essential truth. Karina left active duty on a Friday afternoon. She cleared her office of personal items, turned in her badge and equipment, signed final paperwork. She walked out of the building where she'd taught for 5 years and looked at the sky. Clear and blue, perfect flying weather. Somewhere overhead, students were practicing tactical formation. Somewhere else, combat pilots were supporting ground troops. The mission continued without her, which was exactly right. The military machine was bigger than any individual. It absorbed retirements and continued functioning. She drove to the flight line one last time. Staff Sergeant Chen was there, now a master sergeant with more gray in his hair. He'd requested reassignment to follow her to the weapons school years ago. Now he was retiring too, his 20 years complete. They stood together looking at the A-10's parked in neat rows. Ugly, beautiful machines that had carried them both through deployments and missions. Chen asked if she'd miss it. She said yes. He asked if she had any regrets. She said no. He nodded. He said that was the right answer. They walked the flight line together one last time. She touched the nose of her old aircraft, tail number 817, still flying after all these years. The maintenance crews had kept it airworthy through multiple deployments and thousands of flight hours. It would outlast her career and probably outlast Chen's retirement. That was the nature of good machines. They persisted beyond the people who'd relied on them. She hoped future pilots would appreciate the aircraft as much as she had. Chen asked what she'd do in retirement. She said she hadn't decided yet. Maybe teach civilian flying. Maybe write about her experiences. Maybe just rest for a while and remember what it was like to not plan for missions or write reports. He said that sounded reasonable. He said he was going to work on restoring old cars, something mechanical he could understand and fix with his hands. They agreed to stay in touch, but both knew they probably wouldn't. Retirement meant moving forward, not staying connected to the past. But the years they'd worked together would remain, stored in memory like medals in drawers. Karina drove away from the base for the last time. The gate guards saluted her retired military ID card. She pulled onto the highway and merged into civilian traffic. The base disappeared behind her in the rearview mirror. Ahead was the rest of her life, undefined and open. She found she wasn't worried about it. She'd survived combat, investigations, and the complex politics of military service. She'd figure out retirement too. 6 months later, she was living in a small house in Colorado, near the mountains she'd hiked during previous leave. She'd taken up painting, something she'd never had time for during her career. She was terrible at it, but improving slowly. She painted landscapes mostly. Mountains and sky, the view from 10,000 feet, the colors of sunset over hostile terrain. She was trying to capture on canvas what she'd experienced in flight. She wasn't sure it was working, but the attempt felt worthwhile. She received letters occasionally from former students. They updated her on their careers, asked for advice, shared stories about missions. She responded to each one with thoughtful answers. She was no longer their instructor, but she remained invested in their success. Meridian wrote most frequently, usually every few months. She'd been promoted to major and was now a flight commander. She was teaching new pilots the lessons she'd learned. The circle continued. One letter arrived in autumn with news that made Karina pause. Webb had been killed in a training accident, mechanical failure on takeoff. He'd successfully ejected, but the parachute had malfunctioned. He died on impact. The funeral would be at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. She was invited to attend. She sat with the letter for a long time, processing the information. Webb had been a good pilot and a good man. He'd supported her during the investigation. He'd become a friend in the way military people became friends, connected by shared experience and mutual respect. Now he was gone, reduced to memory and a name on a wall. She attended the funeral. Hundreds of people came, current pilots and former students, command staff and enlisted personnel, Webb's family looking lost in their grief. The ceremony was formal and moving, with jets flying overhead in missing man formation. She stood with other pilots from their deployment, now scattered across different assignments and ranks. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They'd all known the risks. Webb had just been unlucky. After the service, she found Meridian in the crowd. The younger pilot looked shaken. She said it wasn't fair. Webb had been too good to die in a training accident. Karina agreed it wasn't fair, but said that fairness wasn't guaranteed. They could only control their own actions and hope the aircraft and equipment did what they were supposed to do. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes good people died for mechanical reasons that had nothing to do with skill or judgment. That was part of military aviation. That was part of the deal they'd all accepted. They walked through Arlington together, past rows of white headstones marking service members from wars spanning centuries. Karina thought about all the stories represented here. Pilots and ground troops, sailors and Marines, people who'd served and died, people who'd made hard choices and lived with consequences, people whose names would be remembered or forgotten depending on circumstances and chance. She thought about her own place in this continuum. She'd survived. She'd retired. She'd been lucky. That luck felt heavy sometimes. Meridian asked if Karina ever wondered what would have happened if the rescue had gone wrong, if she'd been shot down, or if Meridian had been killed before extraction. Karina said she'd wondered exactly that. She'd run the scenarios in her mind hundreds of times, different choices leading to different outcomes. She concluded that she'd still make the same decision because the alternative was unacceptable. Meridian said she understood that now in a way she hadn't when she was younger. She said she hoped she'd have the same courage if faced with similar circumstances. Karina said she would. She'd already proven it in combat. They parted ways after the funeral. Meridian returned to her squadron. Karina returned to Colorado. She added Webb's funeral program to the box where she kept her medals and citations, reminders of a career that had meant something, evidence that she'd existed and mattered in a small corner of military aviation history. She closed the box and put it back in the closet. The past was important, but dwelling on it served no purpose. The present required attention. Years passed. Karina aged with grace, her hair going fully gray, her face acquiring the lines that came from decades of flight under stress. She remained fit through hiking and exercise. She continued painting with slowly improving skill. She lived quietly, maintaining minimal contact with her former military life. Occasionally, she gave talks at Air Force events about her career and experiences. She was careful never to glorify the unauthorized rescue. She emphasized the complexity of the decision and the consequences that had followed. Young pilots needed to understand both parts of the story. One spring afternoon, she received a package from Meridian. Inside was a photograph from an A-10 squadron's deployment ceremony. Dozens of pilots standing in formation, all wearing flight suits, all looking young and determined. A banner behind them read Rusalka Squadron in stylized letters. The note from Meridian explained that the squadron had adopted the name to honor the pilot who'd shown them what integrity and courage looked like. They wanted Karina to know that her legacy continued through them. Karina studied the photograph for a long time. She recognized some faces from students she'd taught. Others were strangers, new pilots she'd never met but who'd apparently heard her story. They looked eager and competent, ready for the challenges ahead. She hoped they'd never face the kind of decision she'd faced. But if they did, she hoped they'd choose correctly and accept the consequences. She wrote back to Meridian, thanking her for the photograph and the honor. She said she hoped the squadron lived up to the name. She said she was proud of all of them. The photograph went on her wall next to her paintings of mountains and sky. It looked right there. Art and memory combined, past and present connected. She looked at it each morning and thought about the young pilots who carried a name she'd been given by a Russian exchange pilot decades ago. The name had traveled far, from Cold War rivalries to Afghan valleys, from unauthorized rescue missions to squadron traditions. It had accumulated meaning along the way, becoming something larger than its original Slavic mythology. It had become shorthand for doing the right thing regardless of cost. That seemed like a good legacy. On her 52nd birthday, Karina woke to mountain sunrise and made coffee. She took it to her back porch and watched light creep down the peaks. She thought about everything she'd seen and done. 2 air forces, 3 wars, hundreds of missions, thousands of students, one rescue that had defined everything else. She thought about the people she'd known, some still alive and thriving, others dead from combat or accident or simply time. She thought about the A-10's still flying, still supporting ground troops, still bringing pilots home. She thought about the name Rusalka, now carried by pilots she'd never meet. And she thought about a young captain hiding in rocks in an Afghan valley, listening to enemy fighters search for her, hearing an A-10's engines overhead and knowing someone had come. She thought about what that moment must have felt like. The relief, the gratitude, the understanding that sometimes the rules mattered less than the people they were supposed to protect. She thought about how that moment had rippled forward through years and careers, changing lives and building traditions. One decision, one unauthorized launch, one rescue that had cost her promotion, but bought something more valuable. She finished her coffee as the sun cleared the mountains. Another day beginning. Another morning to be grateful for consciousness and memory. Another opportunity to appreciate what she'd built through years of service and sacrifice. The military career was over, but its meaning persisted. That seemed sufficient. That seemed like more than enough. She went inside to start her day, leaving the door open so mountain air could flow through her small house. Outside, the sky was blue and clear, perfect flying weather. Somewhere, pilots were taking off for missions. Somewhere, Rusalka's squadron was living up to its name. The story continued, as stories do, through new voices telling old truths in new ways. And that was exactly how it should be.